Okay.
Go ahead, Joel.
All right. So can we, can you see that next slide?
Yep.
Or no? You can?
Livable
You
California.
tell me which slide you want, and
Okay. Well, why don't we just go, and I'll just tell you to move this slide, okay?
right.
So the first one is, Aristotle, which because you heard me, so you don't need to see the picture. I already discussed the whole question of feudalism, basically a concentration of wealth and power in California, decline of the middle class, and growth of both the very poor and the very rich. And next slide is, we're talking about housing costs being, what makes California more expensive is not so much the cost of food or the cost of energy, it's the cost of housing. This is being driven by the housing policies, as Jill mentioned. The biggest thing we think is the urban growth boundaries, in other words, because you cannot grow in the periphery, there is no competitive land market. If you take the Bay Area, and the Bay Area plan is to say 80% of all development should be in 4% of the land, you don't have to be Milton Friedman to understand what the effect of that is going to be.
Joel, say next slide when you're ready. Right now we're on the colored pie.
Okay, next slide, please. See that? And what you see is we have great degree of volatility. That's because we have these tremendous spikes. So I think we may be headed towards another one of these precipitous declines. Particularly the multifamily market, high-end multifamily market is headed for a major disaster. I think unlike the 2007-2008 one, which was heavily concentrated in new suburban, since we don't have a lot of new suburban, but we have a lot of high-end rental multifamily, I think that's what's going to get hit. Next slide, please. Our California policies are creating just tremendous levels of unaffordability. The median multiple is the median price of house compared to median salary. So you can't say, well, San Francisco is more expensive because salaries are higher. Well, we can normalize for that. So in 1969, as you can see, California, as wonderful as it was at that time, attracting lots of migrants from the rest of the country, our prices were not exceptionally higher relative to income than anywhere else. So if you go to 2018, the United States is at a median multiple of 3.7, California is at 7.3, LA is at 9.0, San Francisco at 7.7, San Diego 7.7, San Francisco at 8.4, and San Jose at 8.8. Now you may be surprised, why is LA worse in this measurement than the Bay Area, even though prices are higher in the Bay Area? That is a function of the fact that the Bay Area has higher salaries, less poverty. So even though prices are higher, there is a greater ability to pay, but we're still talking now about 2 to 3 times what you would pay. Let's say if you wanted to move to Dallas, your Dallas housing prices relative to your income will be much lower. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? It means that the percentage of the population able to afford a median price house in 2018 relative to 2000, and obviously we keep ratcheting up and with more and more regulatory problems. You can see in LA, 58% drop. Drops pretty much everywhere. Statewide, about 48.9. The rest of the country, actually, housing is actually, the percentage of people who can afford housing has actually gone up. This is, as we get into migration, you'll begin to understand how this distinction between us and the rest of the country is playing itself out. Next slide. No big surprise, California is now second to New York, lowest home ownership rate. Now, this is a state whose great period of growth was really based around single-family home ownership. That was what was a big driver. We've been falling behind, and I think, frankly, our state leaders would be happy to have a state where everybody was a renter. Also, renters are more likely to vote for the policies that the current regime likes. So maybe they don't really think that home ownership is worthwhile. If you go to the next slide, one of the big reasons why home ownership is important has to do with what the wealth is, net worth of families by thousands of dollars. Basically, the owner is much more likely to have some asset over time. The renter doesn't. This is also low home ownership rates among minorities mean that they are more disadvantaged over time. Just think about how many people have been able to retire nicely because they had a house, which, you know, hopefully will include me someday. Next slide. So what is the effect we're having on California? This is one of the things that I find most insane. If you're on the considering moving out of California slide, what's really interesting is that we keep being told that we need to build all this stuff. We have to have all this high density housing because our population growth. Hey guys, California is not growing. We think that probably by the end of this year, California will start going negative, which we've never seen. We're going to lose a congressional seat, at least that's possible. That's never been seen in our history. So this idea that we have to build all this stuff when we have 1 million empty units and we have a population that's not growing is probably not very logical. So if you take a look overall in California, who's thinking of moving out, you can see it's about a majority. I would look at that dark purple in particular. And also look who's leaving. You know, a lot of times people say, well, the people leaving are a bunch of, you know, grumpy old, you know, white people over the age of 65. That's actually not what's happening. The group that's leaving is in their 30s and 40s. And of course, those are people who are in child rearing ages and also the ages where people buy houses. The older people, frankly, you know, people like me, yeah, we've done okay. You know, I bought my first house in Hollywood, 1980 for $150,000. So you can imagine that I've ridden this inflation fairly well. It's younger people who are more stressed by this.
The global pandemic.
Now, and obviously,
please turn, Joel, hang on. Please turn off your microphones, everybody. And somebody's asking for next slide. He's not quite ready, but he will go to the next slide. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm on the next slide, but thank you. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. I'm from Brooklyn. I speak really fast. And of course, because I'm a New Yorker, I don't care whether you can understand me or not. But anyway, housing prices is the biggest reason. Now, taxes do their job. But really, the reason people are leaving more than anything is high housing costs. This is from the UC Berkeley poll that was done this September. Now, the real crisis, so if you go to the next slide, and this is something that is not discussed, and this will be in our feudalism report that will be out, I would say, within a month. We're trying to wait till we can actually have an event. The real problem is not only high costs, but the high costs are happening when we're not creating high wage jobs. Basically, between 2008 and 2018, 5 times more below average paying jobs were created than above average paying jobs. So fundamentally, we've been having this enormous pace of housing and rental increases at a time when we're not creating the jobs to pay for it. I mean, one of the reasons people were able to buy homes, let's say in the San Fernando Valley circa 1970, was there were a lot of jobs that paid reasonably well, and the price of homes wasn't that high. And it wasn't, you didn't get a big bonus by moving to Phoenix or Dallas. You were better off staying in California. We are not generating that kind of economy anymore. If you go to the next slide, because this is stuff I think you guys maybe have never heard. 86% of the jobs were added were under the average pay. 48% paid under $40,000. I mean, that's, how do you live, particularly anywhere in coastal California, for under $40,000 is beyond me. And as you can see, we really are not creating a lot of middle-class jobs in California. Next slide. Now, important is I do a lot of work nationally and internationally, is we try to compare this with other states, and those jobs have been disappearing in California at a fairly rapid rate, whereas they've been growing in at least some of the other states. But the huge loss in California. If we go to the next slide. We are very good at creating low wage jobs. And by the way, one of the few growth areas, particularly in Southern California, has been hospitality, which is notoriously low paying. And I wonder what the social consequences are going to be. Let's say I live about 15 minutes from Disneyland. What happens to those people who are probably not going to go back to work, maybe for 6 months, maybe for a year? I really just have no idea what the social implications are going to be. So not only are we creating low wage jobs, but a lot of those low wage jobs are in fields like retail and hospitality that have been particularly hard hit. Somehow, I don't understand why no one thinks that we're not going to have an enormous social crisis in this state as a result of existing conditions that are made worse. But that doesn't seem to be something that the media is interested in. Next slide. And of course, the worst place outside of some of the tourism-oriented places, particularly in Southern California, we have incredible poverty in our interior counties. If we look at the slide on, that shows you some of the poorest counties in the United States are interior California. These areas are generating very few good paying jobs. And they've been almost completely ignored by the state leaders. And of course, when you go after industries like agriculture, manufacturing, and energy, you're taking away what was left of good blue collar jobs. But again, I don't think our state leaders really care about these people anyway, but I think we should. Next slide, please. So I want to talk now a little bit about demographics, what's actually happening. Now, remember, none of this will be able to measure what's happening with COVID. We're searching the internet, we're looking at what we can find, but right now, since we don't have any numbers, but since the census is being delayed, I think we will, in the 2020 census, I think we can project a pretty dramatic number. So if we go to the next slide, first of all, I just want to give you an overview because, you know, I teach urban history, so you're going to get subject to this. One of the things that we find out is cities around the world have been de-densifying. Almost all cities have less population in their cores than they had in 1900. Manhattan went from about 2.5 million to, it's now 1.7. It was down to 1.5. So in other words, this idea that there's this massive movement into the inner city is just simply not really the case. And I'm going to show you this in so many ways that you'll probably be tired of hearing it. If we go to the next slide, we take a look at growth between 2010 and 2018. Urban cores in the United States in the major 53 metropolitan areas was 8.2%. So the vast majority of the growth, even here in California, as I'll show you, has been in the very areas that our betters don't want us to move to. We don't want people to live in suburbs. We want them to live in core cities, but disobedient, little children that we are, we still go things that are best for us and our families and what are affordable. So this is the national pattern. If we go to the next slide, you can see the same thing is happening on a national basis, which is really interesting. What we're finding is that major cities have been declining in domestic migration. That's all major cities.
Is that, Joel, is that the red line, the major cities?
Yeah,
Okay.
The major city, over 1 million, over 10 million, it's even worse. Of course, over 10 million is really only LA and New York. As you can see, there's been a significant decline starting about really about 2012, 2013. And what we're seeing, which we hadn't seen in a long time, is big growth in smaller cities, cities of 500,000. cities under 1 million. And we're starting to see even small areas beginning to gain population. This is all pre-COVID. We think COVID's going to make this happen more rapidly, but again, that's just a supposition, which we can talk about. Okay, next slide. We've been told by our betters that people were leaving the suburbs, moving to the city. That was never true, even in 2011, 2012, which was a very strong period for core cities. Since then, it's obviously changed. More people moving to the suburbs. Lots of reasons for that. Aging of the millennial population is one of them. Costs. The fact that people getting to an age they want to have children and they don't want to live in a studio apartment for some unknown reason. So as you can see, this pattern again is national. So I'm trying to make the point that what I'm talking about when I get to California, this is part of a national trend. And despite all the insane and painful regulation, we're actually seeing the exact same thing. So go to the next slide. I just want to talk a little bit about COVID. New York has 80% of the very high density areas. There is a clear relationship between not just density, but density, poverty, and transit. San Francisco is not as hard hit because it doesn't have a big poverty population, and many of the people in San Francisco have jobs where they could work out of their apartments or homes, whereas in New York, the worst effects have not been in the fancy Upper East Side where everybody went to the Hamptons or their country houses or could work at home. The really bad effects are the people, working class people, who are keeping this country going, who are have no choice. If you live in, where my mother was from, which is East Brooklyn, as she said, crappy neighborhood then, crappy neighborhood now, those areas are where the infections are worse. And also, by the way, in some of the suburban areas where people take the train into the city, basically Californians use transit about 1/4, 1/5 the rate of New Yorkers. So I think that's just something, Wiener is going to be pushing density on transit, which people are rejecting already. I don't think there's going to be a big rush to get on the train when this dies down. So let's go to the next one. So if you take a look at California, 87% of the growth in the LA area has been in the suburban and exurban areas. The inner city, not just downtown, but the inner core of LA, if you know, sort of the Wilshire district, some of the immediate areas around downtown have been less than 10% of all the growth in the area. San Francisco is about 75%. Riverside, San Bernardino, there's basically no inner city at all. San Diego, it's 98.9%. Sacramento's 97.5%. So what we're doing is we're trying to ban where the vast majority of the growth is taking place and forcing it into the places people are not going to.
Joel, would you pause on this slide? There's a bunch of people commenting in chat asking Rick to go to presentation mode. I don't use presentation mode, but people want it to be cleaner so just so they can see it better. I really don't know how you would do that, Rick, but is there a way for you to do that? Because we've got 4 or 5 people asking that you do it. Tom Rubin is saying, please hit slideshow at the top of the PowerPoint screen, then hit from the current slide, and that will make the slides larger and easier to see. Then just use the mouse for the next slide. If that makes any sense, could Rick please do that? And if he can't get to it, everybody, you're just going to have to live with the current look of the presentation. But thanks for weighing in.
All right, Rick, should I wait for you to do this?
Yeah, Jill, repeat those instructions from Tom again.
Yeah, of course. Hit slideshow at the top of the PowerPoint screen, then hit current, then hit from current slide. There should be something called from current slide, and that will make the slides larger and easier to see. Then just use the mouse to get to the next slide.
Okay, did that work?
It looks, yeah, I don't know if it's any bigger, but it's way cleaner.
It's working.
Okay. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
All right, thank you. Thank you for those suggestions. Now I'll have to try to remember them when I teach on Monday.
I'll
Okay,
save it for you.
great, thank you. All right, so if we can go to so anyway, you can see what's going on here. Let's go to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at the Bay Area. Really interesting what we're seeing in the Bay Area. And again, so absolutely opposite of what the state is doing. San Francisco, given one of the great economic booms in modern history that's taking place in the Bay Area, was actually gaining population. Very unusual, hadn't been gaining domestic migrants. That is people coming from other countries, from outside, not other countries, but other parts of the US. San Francisco has gone from a positive in 2013 of 15,000 to a negative 25,000. San Jose didn't attract as many people, but is now also dropping. The exurbs are the only places that have done okay, still losing. The population's moving to the Central Valley. And that's where you're getting your super commuters. And of course, this makes absolutely no environmental sense. One of the things that we're going to propose in our report is that the state should have a policy to try to bring jobs to places that people can afford to live, instead of forcing people to move to places that they can't afford to live so that they can get a job. It makes no sense at all. If I can go to the next slide, please. Same pattern in LA. You can see the suburban areas have either been stagnant or gained a little bit, particularly Riverside. Orange County is not growing at all anymore, but LA is losing. And LA, the last 2 years, has actually lost population, as has New York, as has Chicago. We think San Francisco will probably begin to lose population in the next year or two. The trajectory, as you saw, was pretty strong. If we can go to the next one, please. And overall, California is having massive outmigration. Now, what's really interesting from a historical point of view is I've never seen a state going through an economic expansion, which was pretty robust, at least a couple of years ago, and actually losing people. Usually economic growth brings people in. We don't have that. We have a new model of economic growth in California that manages to repel people, which is, you know, quite an innovation. So anyway, you can see that. If we go to the next one, international migrations also drop. Some of the biggest drops in population of immigration in the country are in the LA area, which was always a major place for international migration. And today, for the first time in history that we know of, the South is now the leading region for immigration. Immigrants aren't stupid. They come to the United States and they say, well, I can move to LA. I can live in a crappy apartment in an area with bad schools, or I can move to a North Dallas or West Houston and buy or at least live in a decent place and have a chance of a good school district. And I have a better chance of getting a good job given my skill set. It is just astounding. Just a funny story, because I'm working on something on heartland migration from immigrants right now, is I was there in Fargo, North Dakota with my daughter, and she wanted a ice cream. So we were walking around and we went to a Thai ice cream shop in downtown Fargo, and we were the only non-Asians there. So something is happening. So immigration, which I think did play an important role in sparking California's economy, is now beginning to die down. And we're creating an environment where immigrants are less likely to come. So if we can go to the next one. So if we take a look of who the other group that's leaving in big numbers, this is similar to that Berkeley poll, but this is actual IRS data, which is very good data. The people leaving the most are not the millennials, but 35 and over. Now, millennials are now getting into their 30s, but the young people, that we're losing some, but we're really getting killed in those people who are at the peak earning years, or in the years that people buy houses, and the years that they raise families. That we're getting hammered with, and I'll show you more of that. If we go to the next one, 5 to 14. One of the things we know about this is nationally, people don't have kids in the urban core. They just don't. Sometimes they'll have a baby, but once the baby is ambulatory, and particularly when they need to go to school, they leave. By the way, this is universal, virtually everywhere, and in almost every other country as well. Basically, the nurseries of the country are in the older suburbs, and the exurbs are where people are most likely to have kids. So if you have a policy that's hostile to suburbs and exurbs, you actually have a policy that's kind of hostile to children as well. If we go to the next slide, this is, I think, pretty shocking stuff. Raleigh, Austin, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Denver, Washington, Seattle have gained children. There's been a slight increase in San Jose, decrease in San Francisco, but San Francisco was very low. You know, they always say San Francisco, you know, more dogs than kids. And San Francisco is, you know, a city with, by one account, more drug addicts than high school students. You know, I guess that's a model society that Wiener wants for the rest of us. And as you can see, the big declines are LA, Chicago, New York. So we're having fewer children. And this is really interesting. California has always been a younger state than the rest of the country. You'd think, well, this is where young, ambitious people go. It's where families want to go. If you go to the next slide, what you find is we are aging about 50% faster than the national average. People are not having children in California. And so we're now about at the national average. Also, by the way, our population that used to be filled with people who were born somewhere else now is very heavily dominated by people who were born here. And actually other states like Arizona and Texas are going in the exact opposite direction because people are moving there. If we go to the next slide. So I want to just get a little bit on the policy side, then I'm really looking forward to your comments. I don't care what you say as long as it's polite. So this next slide, we're talking about my idea, which is which we call archipelago of villages. One commentator called it smart sprawl. We should be looking at how do you put housing near where people can afford to live. I think these areas would be very attractive. I think that we can have some of the urban amenities in more suburban environments, which we're starting to see. Places like Valencia have this now. I think we can have open space around these areas. This is the Ebenezer Howard idea of the garden city. I think we certainly could do that. And we can make a sprawl, if you will, that is sustainable and good for the environment. And what we're doing now is not so good for the environment. So we'll go to the next slide. California, it loves to talk about how we are the cutting edge of reducing GHG. Well, from 2007, 2015, and we're updating this now, we were about 40th in per capita reductions. And if you included all the emissions of companies, particularly manufacturing companies that have left the state, and the people who have left the state, actually, it's probably we haven't done anything at all to reduce it. You know, when you're let's say your aerospace company or your manufacturing company of any kind or any service company moves from California to Arizona, their carbon footprint goes up because you have the cost of keeping the place cool is much higher. So actually, we're probably having at best a neutral and probably most likely a negative effect by these policies. If we go to the next slide, I think we have to rethink density. This idea that density is necessarily good for the environment, I think, is very much a mistaken one. one interesting issue that has not been discussed, and it's in this slide here on rethinking density, is heat islands. I've had speeches in Manhattan in the summer that when it's 95 in Manhattan, I get to Brooklyn, it's 85. You get to Long Island, it's 75. High density environments tend to have higher temperatures. I mean, people who are, if we go to the next slide, I love this one. This is in Phoenix, Arizona. You know, anyone who thinks high density steel and glass structures in the desert make sense. I don't know, you know, why they would think that would be the case. And what's happening is the desert outside of Phoenix can be as much as 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius less hot than the inner city itself. Suburbs are obviously going to have some heat, but they're certainly not hotter than dense inner city areas. Go to the next slide. This was a study done by an environmental group in Australia, and actually when they looked at the number of people that were living in these in the high density as opposed to a suburban environment, how often people traveled, how often they had to go out to eat, the common areas, actually the core was in some measurements worse than the suburbs. Again, this is a whole area of debate. By the way, the study done by Berkeley on all the densification policy found that at best, densifying California would create a almost insignificant, maybe 1% contribution to the climate goals. So we're causing a lot of pain for very little reason. If we go to the next slide, this I find the most interesting, telecommuting, which I think is, you know, it's not going to stay at the level it is right now, but it's been growing 44% in the last 5 years, 91% over 10 years, 159% over 12 years. My sense of it is that it will grow significantly. We've been doing interviews with CEOs here in Orange County, and they are surprised how well the dispersed work is working. I think people who are getting used to it. Someday I'll be able to be the master of Zoom. I'm not there yet, obviously, but it does make things possible. Amazing to me, state of California has no policy to encourage telecommuting. So in other words, instead of saying we can cut your carbon footprint by a big amount by having you work at home, we will have you cut it by a small amount by making you live in an apartment and, you know, spend hours trying to get to work on the bus. And that's why whenever I hear from the density advocates that they're doing it for the environment, and they say, well, why aren't you for telecommuting? They have no answer for that. There is no answer for that. Because I think, and I'll venture an opinion, I think this is less about the environment and more about social control and social engineering. Telecommuters tend to like to have a house or at least an apartment where there's space, and they're harder to control. And they're independent, and they actually maybe don't need government for everything in their lives, which of course seems to be the regime's interest. So anyway, telecommuting, it's astounding. We have no policy to encourage that. By the way, many states are doing that, but we're not. Some states are even encouraging telecommuters to come from other states, and they're helping them set up, and they're giving them some sort of bonus. But of course, that's not happening in California. If you go to the next slide, transit, which is, you know, the whole principle around Wiener's bills. Transit is gone from, as you can see, from 820 to 915. Over the last 8 years, the share has gone down, and you can see the number of people working at home has gone. So now in California, many more people work at home than commute by transit. After COVID, I think it will get even, it will be great, much greater. Next slide. If you take a look at the Bay Area, this idea that, you know, San Francisco, everybody works in the Bay Area, works in San Francisco, but 8.4% work downtown, 7% work in the outside of outside of downtown, but in San Francisco. In the Bay Area, about 84% of the people work elsewhere. This is one of the reasons why transit is really not such a great bet. If we go to the next slide, this is a slide we took about how many jobs could you reach by in 30 minutes if you took a car or you had transit. San Francisco, you could still do reasonably well. But in the city of LA, it's about 23 times more jobs by car.
Joel, can
yeah.
you slow down on this slide? I don't understand it. Maybe I'm just losing it here, but what are we seeing?
With other words, the number of jobs that you could get by car as opposed to by transit. So in certain areas, let's say in Willowbrook, which is a part of LA, a fairly poor area, a person with a car can get to 156 times many jobs in a half hour by car than they could by transit. So, one of the big losers, and this goes with Jennifer Hernandez's lawsuit, is this policy is absolutely terrible for working.
That's not good.
And really restricts the number of jobs that they can get to. And so, is that clear, Jill?
I think so. If you just say it one more time, like give us the example of San Francisco. What does that 3 mean?
The 3 means that if you have a car, you can get to 3 times as many jobs in a half hour than if by transit, but that's a relatively low number. But if you go to, let's say, Willowbrook, which is a poor area in LA, it's 156 times. So fundamentally, pushing people into transit gives them fewer choices where to work. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, the next slide. And then in LA, now we're talking about the densest urban area in America, not just the city of LA, but compared, because what people don't realize is greater New York and greater Boston, once you get out of the city, it actually gets pretty bucolic. And I know in Westchester County, where my brother lives, half an acre is considered small. In LA, we have density, but it's a dispersed density. By the way, that's true of the Bay Area outside of San Francisco. In the LA area, about 2010, work at home passed transit. Again, why we have no policy to encourage that and why we are going to invest more money in a mode that in the LA area is actually losing ridership. We have a smaller share of people today taking transit in LA than we did in 1990 before we spent $20 billion. And I know Tom Rubin knows more about this than I do, and it may be interesting to hear from him as well. So we go to the next slide. Where we think this is going, well, this is a study done by the Bain company. They think there'll be more decentralization, particularly as we get to autonomous vehicles. If you go to more decentralization is likely, because it will obviously reduce a lot of the negativities of living further out. I think the combination of autonomous vehicles and greater use of work at home will disperse things. I also think companies need to think about moving more and more of their operations to places, again, where people can afford to live. But the idea that we're going to have more density is violated by both technology and by what the data is telling us, even in the last 10 years. We can go to the next slide.
Joel, can I interrupt before you go to the next slide? Mohit, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, and Mary and others are saying, but when these businesses do move into the suburbs and exurbs, won't the housing prices go up there?
Well, I mean, it all depends. If you're able to build, not so much. Remember, we had no big price inflation when our population was booming. If you talk to developers, what they'll tell you is it's the fees, it's the delays, it's the land price that makes it impossible. It's not, I mean, that's why, like, for instance, in the report, we have an interview with a real estate agent in Fresno who says in Fresno, which is no great shakes economically, you can't build a affordable house, you have to be about 500,000. I have people on my board in Texas who are building townhomes in West Houston for $185,000. So it's clearly a regulatory issue that's sort of at the core of this. But it would conceivably increase the prices. But I think that if we were building enough product, that would be less of a problem. Again, millions of people moved to California without these distortive effects, and that's because the policies were different. So can I go on to the next one?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And of course, one of the things we always are hearing is there's no land in California. And obviously that's ridiculous. The big reductions in farmland are retiring of land that's no longer productive, or because the productive land is so much more productive. So, I mean, there's plenty of land, I've spent a lot of time in the Central Valley. My college roommate lived in Bakersfield, so I used to spend a lot of time down there. There's no question there's lots of land that we could build on. If you go east in the Inland Empire, there's lots of places. And by the way, there are other areas. We have lots of areas that are already zoned for multifamily that are not being built on. And of course, we're going to have this enormous tsunami of retail that could be converted to housing. But the problem there, from what I'm hearing, is tax policy. Localities don't want to give up the sales taxes that keep them afloat. We should figure out some way to give them an incentive. One of the reasons when I talk to people in Texas, I say, well, how come you're building housing? Isn't that a problem? He says, yeah, because we get the property tax revenues, so it actually pays for us to build housing. California has the exact opposite system. If we go to the next one. So here, I'm just going to end with this, and then I'm welcoming your questions. We have a bias against suburbs and peripheral growth. My friend John Mirisch talks about sort of urban supremacism of people like Wiener, who thinks that everybody's dream is to live in a small apartment in San Francisco. That's their dream of life. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Again, we have this problem with taxes I just mentioned. I think the government and middle class are at loggerheads. I really and truly don't think that the concern of the middle class outside of public employees is of any interest to the people who run this state. I don't think it's that they don't like them. They just don't know anybody like that. They don't live in that circle. I mean, I'm really happy that Tom Steyer is going to worry about small business. I'm sure it's his big concern. Most jobs and people continue to move to suburbs. So we've got this problem, which is one of the reasons prices are so high is we make it very difficult to build in the suburbs. And of course, that has the ancillary effect of making urban land more expensive. And so actually everybody kind of suffers. And I think that where we're headed as a society is what I refer to in the new book as neo-feudalism. Or I guess I don't know if it's any better, or we end up where everybody essentially is on the dole, and everybody depends on the state. And the question is, does Google and Facebook and Apple have enough money to pay for everybody? I kind of guess they don't, but we'll find out. So anyway, I know that was a lot of stuff. I went as fast as I could, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Rick, if you'll put us back on regular view and not looking at the slideshow, that would be great. Everyone, please keep your microphones muted. We'll get to some of your questions, and you'll get some interesting answers from Joel. We have, we have 150 people on this call. So I think one of the biggest questions coming in here, Joel, is, well, a couple of them, but one of the big ones is, what about the constant spin from media and legislators is that if we build in the suburbs, it's sprawl and it's worse than crowding the people into the dense areas because they'll drive further, the GHG levels will go up. And, you know, this is the reigning theme. And so probably 10 different people have asked about that.
All right, well, I think the first thing, Jill, is that what we're doing now isn't working. I mean, because the reality is people aren't widgets. You can't tell people, oh, you have to live the way I want you to live. And by the way, easy for Tom Steyer with God knows how many houses and a big house in San Francisco and a ranch. Yeah, well, that's fine for him, as long as, but the serfs have to live like crap, and they don't want to live like crap, and I don't blame them. So what happens is people are forced to move further and further away to get what they want, and then they end up driving more. I don't see where that's very helpful. If people work at home, that's going to be a big saving. If Google, instead of putting another office in a place people can't afford to live, and they put it in Modesto and had an opportunity for people to live near where they work, it would have a better effect. So, I mean, clearly what's happening now just simply isn't working. I just don't, you know, there's no way of justifying it. And we have a social cost. And again, that's why any of you who are not familiar with Jennifer Hernandez's lawsuit, you know, you really should familiarize yourself. Middle and working class Californians are being screwed. Now, the old, you know, as we would say in Yiddish, the older cockers like me, who bought in early, we're okay. You know, and as long as we can keep the bubble going, I'll cash out and move someplace and retire on on what I made on my houses. But the reality is, this is a terrible policy. It's not even good environmentally. The other thing is this urban heat island, putting people in small spaces, and clustering development does tend to raise the air. Ali Medeiros has done great work with this at the University of Washington. So I just think that this makes, you know, very, very little sense on a social or an environmental level. And I think that it's, and basically I think a lot of it is just a front for people who want a social engineer, and some real estate interests who think, well, if I've got that 4% of land that can be developed, I'm going to make a fortune.
Okay, I'm going to ask 3 or 4 more questions from chat, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rick to call on some people and unmute them. One of the big questions is from Jay Bieber. He's a transit expert in Los Angeles. And he said, he asked, do you have any ideas for specific policies that LA or California could implement to encourage telecommuting, especially since they shockingly don't have anything? What would they do or could they do?
Well, one thing they could do, which when I lived in the city of Los Angeles, I had to pay a really big fee for the pleasure of working at home. Now there I was, no office space, same space. I would, you know, get gas once a month. I would go days without driving, and I had to pay a fee. So the first thing you can do is get rid of the fees. That would be a good start. And why not some sort of tax credit if you work at home? I mean, why should we be giving developers credits for building housing people don't want for the environment when we can actually give people who could actually really cut their GHG? I've worked at home for all but 3 months of my life. My old friend, unfortunately passed away recently, Al Toffler, was saying that I did the electronic cottage before it existed. Now, not everybody can do this, but about 35% of the population can. Right now, it's about 7%. Certainly, we could get it to 10 to 15. The GHG implications of that are greater than all the stuff that Wiener and his henchmen want to put in, and at a much lower social cost.
Well, everybody's kind of weighing in on that one, and they like what you're saying on that. What's the, if you were the governor, what would you do if you were the governor?
If nominated, I won't serve, and if elected, if nominated, I won't run. If I'm elected, I won't serve.
But truly, I mean, we've been hitting the governor kind of hard over the last several months for using this 3.5 million housing units are needed, which is not true. It was created by McKinsey and Company, it's a completely fake number. The real number is more like 1 million to 1.3 million housing units are needed. And we don't know, of course, what COVID-19 will do to that 1.2 million, but 1.2 million is way, way more doable. And a lot of that will be built kind of on the natural, but of course that was pre-COVID-19.
Right.
Now we're seeing, I believe Airbnb has collapsed, and we don't know how many empty units that means. We are hearing rumors, but we don't know for sure, that people are moving back to their homes, their families are getting out of the city. We don't know if that's true. What do you see in the housing market? Just guesswork at this point, but because of COVID-19, it might be temporary, but what do you see?
Well, first of all, I think it may be temporary, but it may actually be happening. It will have impact over time. I mean, we have to remember the epidemics of the early 1900s, including the Spanish flu, created a huge reaction in terms of depopulating the urban core. Again, Manhattan went from 2.5 million to 1.5 million. So I think that some of that will take place. But first of all, the 3 million is absurd. How do you have a state that's essentially got no population growth needing 3 million new houses? I kind of miss how that works. I've also seen accounts that there are about 1 million empty units. I mean, one of the really interesting flashpoints.
Where do you get that from? We've had a few people asking on that.
Yeah, I'm looking into it also. This was a real estate source. Again, I wouldn't publish it, and I haven't written it because I don't have proof of it. But there certainly are a lot of unoccupied units. I mean, all you have to do, go to downtown LA around Staples Center and go at 9 o'clock and see how many lights are on in those towers. And by the way, those are towers that are marketed predominantly in China, and I don't think a lot of Chinese are coming. So I just think that there's clearly, the 3 million was a total absurdity. But McKinsey, you can buy McKinsey. I mean, whoever has an interest in pushing an agenda can buy McKinsey. To get they're not. Let me just say, I wouldn't necessarily trust what they do, but the reality is there isn't anything like 3 million units. And the other thing is, where is the demand? Is the demand for high-priced small units, or is it for family-oriented housing, whether it's apartments or single-family houses, vis-a-vis COVID? And I'm in touch with people in New York all the time. And what we're hearing in New York is a lot of people are moving back to their parents' house, or they're moving, if they're wealthy, they're moving to their country houses. You're going to have to figure out how to build housing where people don't have to push an elevator that 50 other people have pushed. I don't know how much people are going to want to share elevators with lots of people. And I think that the transit ridership is obviously going to go down. So I think the real issue is going to be, how do you meet the demand that's really there? Now, the weird thing is, I talk to people in the finance industry. Even before COVID, there was no money. Really, the economics didn't pencil out. Now they definitely don't pencil out. So if we're going to continue to build expensive, high-density housing near transit stops, that's not even going to solve the problem. So it's not just a question of building, it's a question of what you're building. A single-family house for a family or a townhouse is a different product than a studio apartment. And under the Wiener legislation and under the current regulatory regime, that's pretty much all you're going to get. It's like in Manhattan. You can't build a 3-bedroom apartment. When I was a kid growing up, we had lots of middle-class families living in Manhattan. There aren't very many anymore because, a family in a studio apartment, is like, an invitation for a homicide.
Okay.